everybody out there in Bourbon Real Talk land. Randy Sullivan coming to you with a very special episode, and that is the top 11 shelf-available bourbons under $30. Now, we got a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to go through 1 through 4 really quick because we actually covered 1 through 4 on the previous episode of this type. Number 1 was Four Roses Small Batch at $32.99, a little bit outside of the price range, but what we find is that there's not a lot of shelf-available bourbons between $30 and $40 because most of those have become allocated. Number 2 was Old Forester Signature 100 Proof at $24.99. Number 3 was Wild Turkey 101 at $18.99, and number 4 was 1792 Small Batch at $24.97. All of these bourbons were featured on episode 85, named the top 9 bourbons under $60. So if you're interested in 1 through 4, please skip over to episode 85. Check that out. You won't be disappointed. Now, we've got some new ones that we're going to cover. Very excited about that. But before we get started, I'll tell you that if you love Jack Daniels and it's not mentioned, don't be upset. Jack Daniels is a whiskey that I drink. I enjoy it. It is very basic, but for the price, it's a great value. Quality whiskey made with quality ingredients, great company, but technically not a bourbon. Actually, technically is a bourbon according to the standards of identity. Jack Daniels is absolutely a bourbon, but they choose to self-identify as a Tennessee whiskey, and I respect that, so I left them out of the bourbon list. Before we get into the actual whiskeys, I would like to explain to you why I'm wearing my New York beanie, and that is because we are in the middle of Snowmageddon in Texas. In fact, last night was the coldest recorded temperature in Texas recorded history. And we are going through rolling blackouts. In fact, this is the second time that I've recorded this because we lost power in the middle and I lost my sound. So we're gonna try and get through this quickly. The next whiskey that is up is Old Grandad 114, and we also have its brother, Old Grandad Bottled and Bond. So this is kind of a twofer. So Old Grandad Bottled and Bond is $22.99. The Old Grandad 114 is $24.99. They're both distilled by Jim Beam, and it is the high rye mash bill of their bourbon. So it's got a little bit more rye content in it than their regular bourbon mash bill. It is non-age stated, but it is rumored to be around 6 years old, and the Bottled and Bond is 100 proof by law, and the Old Grandad 114 is called 114 because it is bottled at 114 proof. The tasting notes on these two are, it's high rye, so it's a little bit spicy. It's got some cinnamon, a little bit of a pepper note, and there's a floral component in there that's very nice. Not sure what flower it is, but it's a little perfumey. It tastes great. There's some caramelized banana flavors in there that kind of reminds me of my a recipe my wife does in the summer that's like a banana pudding with wafers. It's really good. And there's an undercurrent of a citrus flavor that's more in the direction of, I think, orange. And I'm going to go ahead and say this. All bourbons have the tasting notes of some caramelized wood sugar, caramel, toffee, butterscotch, and they all have vanilla. And that's because those are flavors that come from a new charred oak vessel, because all bourbons are aged in those vessels. There's no reason for me to say it. Every bourbon in this list and every bourbon in every list, the main tasting components are caramel or toffee or butterscotch, whatever your favorite caramelized wood sugar flavor is, and vanilla. All right, so now let's talk about some factoids from this particular distillery. So the man on the label of Old Grandad is actually Basil Hayden. And Basil Hayden is part of the small batch series that Jim Beam produces. And it's the one that gets the most hate online. And I think it's because of these two whiskeys, because the reality is they're all pretty similar. Basil Hayden used to have a higher age statement, but they dropped it. So I'm guessing that they're all about the same age. The only difference really is the proof and the price. And so Basil Hayden's represents a bad quality price ratio when you consider these two wonderful bottles of whiskey. And I think that's why it gets hate. This whiskey has been in continuous production, even during Prohibition, which there aren't a lot of brands that can say that, since 1840. But the brand's been owned by a bunch of different companies, different mash bills, and so on and so forth. But it's kind of interesting that they've always had something in production. The Old Grandad 100 proof is a bottled and bond, which means that it comes from one distillery season. Distillery seasons are January through June or June through December. And it makes it very difficult for the distiller to make a consistent product because they have to pick barrels from that one distillation season. And if something was a little bit different, there may be some inconsistency of the product, but they do a really good job with the bottle and bond. Also means that it's one distiller and one distillery, and it's aged in a federally bonded warehouse for at least 4 years, and it has to be bottled at 100 proof. And they also have to list the distillery on the bottle, which is very interesting in our time of non-distiller producers kind of hiding where the whiskey came from. You can't do that with a bottle and bond. Interesting side note on the Old Grandad 114. A couple years ago, I think it was Bourboner did like the whiskey of the year, and it was George C. Stagg, Four Roses 130th, and William LaRue Weller. And I happen to have all those bottles, so I put together a sample pack and I sent it out blind, but I threw in a fourth double blind sample that was Old Grandad 114. The person who won was a very well-known whiskey drinker in the enthusiast community in North Texas where I live from, so it's not like he was inexperienced. And when I had him rank the samples that I gave him blind, he picked Old Grandad 114 over those epic bottles of whiskey. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Old Grandad 114 is better. Just for his palate, he liked it more that day. But it does say something about the fact that you can find a really great tasting bourbon for a good price. You don't have to drink the unobtainium whiskeys that are out there. Next up, we have Jim Beam Black, priced at $19.99. The distillery is Jim Beam. It is non-age stated, but at one time it did have an 8-year age statement on it. And because distilleries kind of have to maintain that same profile and they can't get too far away from that age, I'm guessing that it's 6 to 8 year barrels that go into this. It is proofed at 86 proof. Tasting notes are banana, citrus in the direction of orange, and peanuts, because it's a little bit nutty. Jim Beam's kind of known for having a nutty flavor to it sometimes. Some factoids, this whiskey is just a cut above the Jim Beam white label. It's got a little bit more age on it. The white label's probably a 4 to 5 year. The first barrel of Beam whiskey was sold in 1795. It was not bourbon, it was a corn whiskey. They've operated continuously except Prohibition. But the neatest thing about the Beams is that they are the first family of bourbon. The Beam name just, it crosses barriers of different brands, distilleries. When you start researching what all the descendants of the Beams have done in the bourbon industry, it is mind-blowing. They started Old Tub, they started Early Times, they started Toddy's Liquor, which is still in business as a liquor store in Kentucky today. They've held key positions at the Stitzelweller Distillery, where Pappy Van Winkle got its start, Heaven Hill, Taylor and Williams, Frankfurt Distillery, Four Roses, Old Judge Distillery, Maker's Mark, Michter's, Limestone Branch Distillery. I mean, it goes on and on. And this one family, and there are other multi-generational families in the whiskey industry, but this one family probably has the deepest and richest history that reaches a greater number of brands that we recognize as bourbon enthusiasts today. Next up, we have Knob Creek Small Batch at $27.99. The distillery is Jim Beam. The age on this one is a 9-year age stated product. Now, they used to be 9-year age stated, then they dropped their age statement, then they dropped their single barrel program so that they'd have more higher age product to go into their regular lines. And now the age statement is back. This particular bottle is at 100 proof, which is a little bump in proof, gives it a little bit more oomph. Tasting notes are cherry for days. It is a rye-based bourbon, so it's got a little bit of that clove and cinnamon flavor. There's a hint of smoke that I think comes from those extra years in the barrel. Some factoids, this brand was launched in 1992. The brainchild of Booker Noe, who was actually a Beam. He came from a line where it was a daughter that had, married somebody else with the last name Noe, but he is from the Beam line. And he and several others were instrumental in kind of rebranding bourbon so that it could have the resurgence that we're all experiencing today. Booker Noe, Elmer T. Lee, Parker Beam, and others were trying to pull bourbon out of the dark ages when it had kind of fallen out of favor and sales were down. They weren't able to penetrate international markets. So they had to come up with some new things. And what Booker Noe came up with was the concept of small batch bourbons, which didn't really exist before he invented it. And the idea is that these are premium barrels that we're blending together in smaller batches that have better flavor. And then they were able to put them in some premium packaging, change branding, charge a little bit higher price. And the success of the small batch bourbons, along with single barrels and cask strengths and things like that, are part of what led bourbon out of that downturn of sales. And now bourbon is respected worldwide and able to penetrate international markets. And we can in part thank the launch of Knob Creek for that. Next up, we have Elijah Craig Small Batch at $26.99. The distillery is Heaven Hill. It is non-age stated, but previously it was a 12-year age stated product. So again, because they had to maintain that profile, I'm guessing that the barrels that go into this are 8 to 12 years. When I've picked Elijah Craig single barrels, that was the age of the barrels for the most part that were in the single barrel program. So I'm guessing that's what they're blending into their small batches. The proof is 94. And the tasting notes are, this whiskey is nutty. It's got a banana component. It's got kind of a fruit medley thing going on. You can taste that it's fruity, but it's hard to put your finger on which fruit you're tasting. It's also got a mild mint note and a mild floral note. The floral note's kind of along the lines of like heliotrope, which is it's what makes baby oil smell like baby oil. So there's a little bit of that perfumey kind of, and it's very nice. I like it. Some factoids: this distillery is family owned and has been since 1935 when it started. All the master distillers of Heaven Hill, a competing brand with Jim Beam, have had members of the Beam family as their master distiller, like every single one in its entire history. In 1996, this distillery was completely destroyed by fire. So they don't exactly know what started the fire, but there was a barrel aging warehouse. And some people say that there was a distillery worker that was smoking and he, somehow caught on fire. Some people say that there was a lightning strike. But regardless of how the fire started, one of these aging warehouses caught on fire. And when the barrels get hot that haven't been touched by fire yet, they expand and they break and the whiskey just goes pouring out. But the whiskey's flammable and there's flames all around, so it catches the flames on fire. And there's literally a river of flaming bourbon going downhill, and it got to some of the other aging warehouses, made its way all the way down the hill to the production facility and completely destroyed this distillery and the still, and then flowed into the local river, and 2 miles of the river were literally ablaze and on fire. They had to do an ecological study. A lot of fish died. It was like this crazy thing that happened. But the good news is that in the Kentucky bourbon industry, there's a lot of camaraderie between even competitors. These families that run these distilleries, they've been in that industry for generations. They all know each other. And luckily, Brown Forman and Jim Beam, both competitors of Heaven Hill, stepped up and were selling finished bourbon to Heaven Hill so that they could keep bottling and keep space on shelves while they picked their production back up. The way they were able to get production picked back up so quickly is they didn't have to build a new still, because that takes some time. You got to order it, maybe takes a couple years. There was a distillery that some investors were trying to resurrect called the Bernheim Distillery, and it was completed, but they hadn't started production yet. And so Heaven Hill was able to come in, buy the Bernheim Distillery, pick production up right off the rip. I'm sure that the Bernheim people made a nice return on their investment for selling their new distillery, and they just built another distillery and opened a couple years later, and it delayed their product launch a little bit, but I'm sure that they took some profits. And that's why the Heaven Hill distillery itself is in Louisville, because that's where the Bernheim distillery had been built. But all the Heaven Hill products are actually aged in Bardstown, where their visitor center is, and the visitor center is at the site of the fire where the distillery was originally before it burned down. Next up, we have Evan Williams Single Barrel. It is priced at $25.97. The distillery is Heaven Hill again. It is aged almost 8 years. Because it's a single barrel, they have the luxury of being able to tell you the barrel date of the whiskey that's in this bottle, and they only use barrels that are between 7 and 8 years old. This one's just under 8 years. The proof is 86.6, and the tasting notes are almost like a toasted barrel bourbon. So you're getting like some toasted marshmallow, chocolate, graham cracker flavors, but not as much as an actual toasted barrel whiskey like the Elijah Craig toasted barrel, whatever. So there's a little bit of smoke, and then there's some fruit components in there that are like a light apple flavor, and maybe a little bit of a citrus flavor as well. So factoids, this product was the brainchild of Parker Beam. Yes, the name Beam, again, master distiller of Heaven Hill. The namesake of this product started distilling in 1783. And in the 1800s, there was an article that was written about Evan Williams stating that he was the first legal commercial distiller in Kentucky. This fact has since been disputed because of some immigration records and whatnot of some other distillers. But another interesting fact, Evan Williams was the first wharf master of the port in Louisville. So if you've ever gone to Louisville, giant river there, that's where they would load bourbon onto barges and take it to other parts of the country, take it down to New Orleans. And being the wharf master would have been a very powerful position. And so not only did he make whiskey back in the 1700s, but he was the first wharf master. Next up, we have Larceny Small Batch. It is priced at $20.99. The distillery is Heaven Hill. It is non-age stated, but it is rumored to be 6 to 10 year barrels, which would be a good bit of age for a whiskey that's this inexpensive. The proof is 92 proof. The tasting notes are peanuts, bananas, a citrus flavor that is also in the direction of orange, which this is actually a wheated bourbon. So wheated bourbons typically do have a citrus flavor, and sometimes it's hard to put your finger on what the fruit is. And so it's kind of in the direction of orange, but it's just kind of citrusy. This brand is actually a relatively new brand. It was launched in 2012, but it's named after an individual whose name is on the bottle. It's John E. Fitzgerald. And basically, you know, the history of this brand and Johnny Fitzgerald and Pappy Van Winkle are all intertwined, because this whiskey is made into Larceny small batch, cash strength, and also it's made into Old Fitzgerald bottled and bond. That product used to be made at the Stitzelweller distillery when the Van Winkle family ran it, and the Van Winkles are famous because they created the Pappy Van Winkle line. And so this whiskey at one time, before it was owned by Heaven Hill, was produced in the same way, probably with the same mash bill as Pappy Van Winkle. It's named after Johnny Fitzgerald. So we went through a period where the production and sale of alcohol was illegal in the United States, called Prohibition. And part of how the people who pushed Prohibition got it passed was by convincing the public that whiskey was not safe. So to get Prohibition repealed, we had to come up with some rules to make whiskey safe to satisfy the public. And one of the rules that we made up was that whiskey had to be made under the supervision of the federal government to make sure that there was no tampering. It's also why you can't buy whiskey in a barrel any longer. You have to buy whiskey in a sealed bottle so that you know that there's no tampering from the point that it left the bonded warehouse until it made it into the consumer's hands. Well, at first, when we started doing this, the distillery had to pay a treasury agent to be at each distillery, and that individual was the only person that was allowed to have a key of the distillery, hence the little keyhole on the label of Larceny. And that person had to unlock the distillery in the morning and lock it up at night. No one could get in or out unless they were there. But this job didn't pay that well. And so many of these treasury agents were famous alcoholics because their main job was to walk around and taste the whiskey and make sure nobody did anything to it. And this Johnny Fitzgerald person developed a reputation at the distillery because he seemed to really like certain barrels over others. And he would consistently taste out of those barrels to make sure that there was no tampering. And so they kind of called it, you know, stealing the whiskey because they couldn't stop him. And he kind of got a reputation for being able to pick what the cherry barrels were. So the distillery would kind of pay attention to which ones he was drinking out of. But later, somebody who owned the rights to the name decided, hey, let's make a whiskey called Larceny to kind of commemorate the fact that this Johnny Fitzgerald guy, he used to steal whiskey out of the warehouse, and now we have this great whiskey to taste. So I'm grateful for all of that. This whiskey was also featured on the podcast that I did about the most polarizing whiskeys. Not exactly sure what people don't like about this one. It is super nutty, and so if you're not into a nutty flavor or the banana flavor, maybe it'd turn you off. But for me, at $20.99, this whiskey packs a punch, and I really enjoy drinking it. Last but not least, we have Maker's Mark coming in at $22.79. The distillery is Maker's Mark Distillery. It is non-age stated product, but when you go on tours there, they tell you that they age to whatever they need to age the barrel to make it taste like it's Maker's Mark, and they tell you that's typically 4 to 6 years. The proof of this bottling is 90 proof. The taste is a medicinal cherry with traditional bourbon flavor. So of course, we're gonna have the vanilla and caramel. This is one of those ones where it's kind of hard to put your finger on what flavor note you're getting because there's nothing that really sticks out, but there's also nothing negative too. So it's just a good bourbon flavor. Now, this distillery was started in 1953, and it was started by Bill Samuel Sr. And one of the things that they started doing, and they still do today, is they rotate their barrels in the aging warehouse, which is a very expensive process. But you can imagine if a barrel is way up high and heat rises, it's going to age differently than it would if it was on the first floor. And to keep that barrel variance from happening, they rotate their barrels in their warehouse, which is extremely labor intensive, and it's impressive. And you can taste in the product that they can produce something that's very consistent. Now, supposedly, Bill Samuel Sr. consulted with the most famous wheat bourbon producer, because this is a wheat bourbon, meaning the flavor grain is wheat instead of rye. Supposedly he consulted with Pappy Van Winkle himself to come up with this mash bill. Now, we don't know whether or not that's just marketing hype now that Pappy Van Winkle's super popular, but given the way the distillers kind of take care of each other historically in Kentucky, certainly not out of the question. Now, one of the other interesting things about this distillery is that Bill Samuel Sr.'s wife, Margie Samuels, was a major driving force behind the development of this brand. And she was operating in roles in that brand before it was socially acceptable for women to participate at that level. And she was just kind of a pioneer for, you know, the women's rights movement and the fact that women can contribute at the same level as men. She was very innovative, and she would think of interesting ways to get her goals accomplished. And one great example of that is she had all the buildings on the distillery location registered as national landmarks so that nobody would ever be able to change the distillery because they were all protected. Unfortunately, she died unexpectedly. And in 1981, they had to sell the brand to pay the inheritance taxes. But the Samuels family still runs the distillery today. Bill Samuels Jr., the child of Margie and Sr., he was actually, and pay attention to this, an actual rocket scientist. Okay, and he left his rocket scientist career, which he jokes that he wasn't good at. Apparently, he blew up a rocket or something, to come back and help run the distillery. So he never really made whiskey, but he was a pioneer in marketing, and he grew the brand to the massive level that it's at today. And he has since passed the leadership of that on to his son, Rob Samuels. So the Samuels family still firmly in control of Maker's Mark, which is very exciting. I will tell you a quick side note about the Samuels family. A few years ago, I went on a double date with my wife. We're at a restaurant. Pretty young server comes up and says, "Hey, can I get you something to drink?" I explained to her we were on date night and I wanted something, you know, a little nicer, something a little special. And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I drink bourbon, but I don't want any Jim or Jack or, you know, turkey or Makers, anything like that. I'm just, you know, I want something that's special." And immediately you saw her countenance change, and he goes, "I really hate to have you list Maker's Mark with the rest of those whiskeys." And I was like, "Oh, no, I like Maker's Mark just fine." So throughout the rest of the meal, it's pretty obvious that she was irritated with me. And I started to get frustrated because I was like, this is a nice restaurant and we're going to give her a good tip. Like, why is she acting like this? And then at the end of the meal, she says, "Hey, I'm going to let you off the hook. My last name is Samuels. My dad is Rob Samuels. And, you know, we make Maker's Mark." So that's why I got upset. And I was like, oh my God, here I am in Dallas, and, you know, one of the granddaughters of this illustrious family is, you know, working in this really high-end restaurant. And I was a little skeptical, so the next time I met Bill Samuels Jr., I said, hey, do you have granddaughters that live in Dallas? And he's like, oh, yes, I do. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to stop talking about that because I don't want to have to admit that I threw Maker's Mark in the list with the other bourbons because they might get upset about that. But I did famously stick my foot in my mouth with the Samuels family, and sometimes people like to hear that story. So I really appreciate everybody who is watching this content. The channel's been growing tremendously, and I'm very grateful for that. In fact, we've been growing so fast that I've made an effort to make sure to explain at the end of every one of my recordings why we do this channel the way that we do. So the purpose of the Bourbon Real Talk channel is to connect people to bourbon so that people can get connected to each other through bourbon, because there's a connective power in bourbon. And I see a lot of division in our world today around politics and different movements that are out there, and people fighting with each other on social media and even saying hateful things to one another. And I want to use the power of bourbon to overcome that. And the way that I figure it is that if somebody can hate a stranger online that they've never met, they never talked to in person, it's just as easy for me to love them. And that's why I have the same outro on all of my recordings. I used to do live videos and educational things in local whiskey clubs, but unfortunately, my brother took his life in 2014. He was a military veteran. He actually had come out of the military addicted to painkillers, as so many of our veterans do, because of the toll that it takes on their body to serve this great country. And he just could never recover from it. And he made that terrible decision to take his own life. And that came as a shock to me and my family. And we realized that there's people all around us that feel separated and disconnected and unloved. And so between me discovering the connective power in bourbon and me losing a loved one that I had no idea felt so separated from the world, that was the impetus for me starting this channel, because I want you as a viewer to feel connected to the world around you and to know that you're not alone. And that's why I end every podcast with the same outro, and that is this. If you woke up this morning and you were unsure whether or not anyone loved you, just know that I love you, and I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk.
This content is being brought to you by the Bourbon Real Talk American Whiskey Aroma Kit. This is a tool that I put together to help all you whiskey aficionados out there develop your palates. You can sit down with the vials and train your senses, or you can sit down with a great dram and break that whiskey down to its components. If you have any interest of purchasing a kit of your own, head on over to bourbonrealtalk.com/shop and pick one up. Thank you for listening.